Welcome into Draft Primer. The Cardinals have plenty of needs to focus on in the draft, which is quickly approaching at the end of the month. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the offense. Alongside Cardinals insiders Darren Urban, Mike Jurecki, and Grialou, I'm Dani Sureck. The Cardinals have 8 picks in this year's draft, starting with the 23rd overall. When you look at the offense, there seems to be one position group that goes above the rest when you're talking about the need for this team. Darren, what position is that, and how have they become so thin there?
Well, it's obviously wide receiver at this point, Dani. I mean, you lost Christian Kirk in free agency. You could be losing A.J. Green. We'll see what happens there. You have DeAndre Hopkins, who's the prototypical number one receiver, and you have some big roles to fill for Rondale Moore. But you don't know if Rondale Moore is going to be there, and you probably could use a number 2. I don't know if you find that guy in the draft, but it would be ideal if they could find somebody that, even if he isn't a number 2, somebody who could step in and play a big role.
It's not just about the position you need. You also have to factor in the other positions and best player available. All kinds of things go into making a draft pick. Mike, 8 picks for the Cardinals. How high should they prioritize drafting a wide receiver?
I would think in the first couple of rounds. I mean, we had 8 guys at the combine run under 4.4, so it's a deep draft at wide receiver. I'm sure you can find a guy in the second and third round, and they all come in different shapes and sizes. I think the Cardinals got enough slot receivers on the roster, so they need somebody that's 6'2", 6'3", that can take the top off the defense and be that physical guy on the outside.
A lot of wide receivers, Craig. What are some top prospects, some guys who have caught your eye at wide receiver?
I'm looking at the taller wide receivers, taller than 6 feet. You know, a 6'3" Treylon Burks, someone that you can put on the outside opposite of DeAndre Hopkins, take some attention away. And it's not just this season, because you need someone this season, but it's also down the road as well. D-Hops turns 30 at the start of the season. He's under contract for 2 more years. So it's immediate, and it's also long-term, the need for the wide receiver spot.
It's a little fascinating to me, the topic, because again, some of it has to do with the future in terms of what you might want to do. I mean, clearly there's an immediate need for this season, but if you take a guy like Jameson Williams, who probably isn't going to be on the board at 23, I think somebody will probably take a flyer on him, but he tore his ACL in the national championship game for Alabama. A lot of people think he's the best receiver in the draft. If somehow, because of the injury, he falls, do you take a chance on him that maybe he misses the first part of the season, but you would really benefit on the backside? It's really interesting as you try and figure these things out.
As a need, because right now you guys have talked about it's really just DeAndre Hopkins and Rondale Moore. There are some other wide receivers. You got Antoine Wesley in there, but this is definitely a need. If you're sitting at 23rd overall, is this so pressing, Mike, that you would think maybe trading up and try and get one of those wide receivers?
I would do the opposite, just because they don't have picks in the 4th and 5th round, and I would go down to 27, 28 and still pick up that 5th-year option. But again, you just have to see. They're going to stick to their board and obviously take the best available player, but I got to think defense will come and play at some point.
The only problem with waiting, though, is your best wide receivers are going to be selected high in the first round. And we saw last year 3 wide receivers taken in the top 10 picks. All 3 had over 1,000 receiving yards last season. So you're looking to build kind of a foundation between quarterback and wide receiver. Kyler Murray here long-term. You need to find that long-term answer at wide receiver.
Not only at wide receiver, but also on offense, the offensive line. Now, the starters seem set. Left to right, you've got DJ Humphries, Justin Pugh, Rodney Hudson, Will Hernandez, who the Cardinals recently signed to play at right guard. Then at right tackle, you've got Kelvin Beachum, as well as Josh Jones, the Cardinals' 2020 draft pick, so maybe a little competition there. However, every starter, except for center Rodney Hudson, will be an unrestricted free agent following this season. So not only are you looking for an offensive lineman for an immediate need, but also long-term. So, Craig, how important is that when you're thinking about what's going to happen with our offensive line as you approach this year's draft?
I think you got to look day one, even depending if someone falls to you at number 23 or someone in the 2nd or 3rd round, because, yeah, it's immediate, but you're also looking beyond 2023. And then the wild card in all this is, what do you do with Josh Jones? Is he a part of that future? And I wouldn't mind taking any position on that offensive line, whether it's center, guard, or tackle, whether that's at 23 or in the 2nd or 3rd round.
Max Garcia played right guard for the Cardinals last year. He signed as a free agent with the New York Giants recently. He was also the backup center, and he saw a good amount of time there due to COVID or injuries at that position. As of now, the Cardinals do not have a backup center. It's a little concerning to me, Darren. So what about looking for an offensive lineman in the draft with some versatility?
I mean, versatility is always good. And to be totally honest, Rodney Hudson was a little bit banged up last year too. So whoever you get at your backup center might actually need to see some time there this year. It really is a good question, especially with that first pick. If a good guy falls there, you know, when you look at Steve Keim and how he looks at his first round picks especially, and I know it's not always the same because you're taking inside linebackers the last 2 years, but in essence, he looks at the quarterback, he looks at edge rusher, he looks at cornerback, and then he looks at left tackle, and those are his primary positions. And so if you get a big time tackle, let's say, that might make sense at 23, maybe you take a look at a guy like a Charles Cross, or if you want to go interior because it's later in the first round, maybe you have a Kenyon Green that might intrigue you. But I think ultimately the way the Cardinals have drafted offensive line, I don't know if I necessarily see an offensive lineman with this pick, especially since they've already have the starters kind of set.
And even though they have the starters, that offensive line was banged up. It took until the final week of the regular season for all 5 starters to start a game with Kyler Murray. You've got to keep that in mind when you're looking at offensive linemen in the draft. We know that offensive line coach Sean Kugler really likes that versatility. You have to kind of plan, you know, a contingency plan to have guys on that depth.
Well, they went through 9 different line combinations. Now, can the Cardinals afford to take a guy at 23 and he basically redshirts? And we know injuries occur. I mean, you want that rookie to come in and contribute first, second, third round picks. You know, you got a big guy like Trevor Penny, 6'7", 325. He's got ideal size out of Northern Iowa. You got Zayon Johnson, 6'3", 312. He's more of a guard. Darren mentioned Green. The best player in the draft, unfortunately, he does play center, and he's probably going to get picked in the top 20, is Tyler Lindenbaum from Iowa. I mean, he does everything right, and usually Ferentz puts a lot of players in the NFL from that position.
The good news for offense is that they have a good amount of starters set. We've talked about some of those on the offensive line, but also quarterback. They've got Kyler Murray. They re-signed backup quarterback Colt McCoy throughout free agency. The Cardinals also signed both tight ends, Zach Ertz and Max Williams, as well as running back James Conner throughout free agency. That's a good place to start. However, there's 8 picks in the draft, so you can't just focus on wide receiver or offensive line. What other positions should the Cardinals address on offense, maybe in those later rounds?
Well, especially since many of their later round picks are legit later rounds. I mean, if we're talking about 5 picks in rounds 6 and 7, you know, those tend to be a little bit more like flyer picks. And I would say running back is the first thing that pops into my head because while you like some of the things you've seen out of Eno Benjamin, he was a 7th round pick himself. It wouldn't hurt to maybe take a guy in the 6th or 7th round that perhaps is a bigger player like James Conner is now. I know you just signed James Conner, but he's had some injuries. Maybe you get a bigger back like that. Or maybe you, again, see somebody like Chase Edmonds, who you just lost in free agency, who you really liked, and maybe you were able to replace him with a rookie. That's a position that makes a lot of sense, especially with so many later round picks to me.
I'm curious about the tight end position. One, it's a deep draft class at that spot. You do have Zach Ertz, but then after that, Max Williams, one, is he going to be healthy? He's only under contract for next season. And then there's a lot of unknown beyond that. And depending on what this offense looks like in 2022, do we see more tight end sets? Or you're going to need someone behind a Zach Ertz to keep that offense going.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they maybe take a light flyer on a quarterback just to kind of run the scout team. The Cardinals have worked out a couple different quarterbacks now. You may get those guys as undrafted free agents. Again, Trace McSorley's on the roster, but we'll see his future. But it wouldn't surprise me if they took a flyer on a guy that can similar skill set to Kyler Murray, but not looking over his shoulder.
And I would also say that some of the positions we've already talked about, we're talking about late round picks and you know how they might work out. Would I be surprised if this team took 2 wide receivers in this draft? No, absolutely not. So even if you take one early and a guy that you're really confident in, again, maybe you see somebody who might have some flash and okay, we'll take them in a later round and see what happens.
Plenty of options for the Cardinals, and thankfully they have 8 picks to do so, starting with that 23rd overall. The draft is quickly approaching from Vegas this year. Thursday, April 28th is night 1. We will have coverage on azcardinals.com leading up to the draft, throughout the draft. We're also going to have a draft primer covering defense. The Cardinals need more than offensive line and wide receivers, so we're going to talk about what they need on defense. So stay tuned on azcardinals.com.